exciting things about Dirk Hellhammer is how many people were his students who have now become professionals. Robert was just talking about that earlier. So in the theme of the student becomes the teacher, I would like to invite Tor Finseth, who's the first author on this article, with a very, very collaborative spirit. If anyone has seen me use a computer, you know that I am not the one who is programming virtual reality. That is actually Tor, and he's in aerospace engineering. So we started a collaboration when he was a graduate student, and we've continued it now that he's doctor. And this is, I think, a very exciting collaboration to have and to explore from a psychoneuroendocrinology perspective, because similar to the presentation we heard earlier, there was this question about what is real, and what greater place to ask what is real than in virtual reality. So, if you actually Google Hellhammer and virtual reality, I just want to point out that there is a game that is, I think he's a sword, obviously he's a hammer. So it's this like really super awesome like tool you can get and buy, and gamers will tell you all about how wonderful it is. Sound off, because I don't know if anyone's ever done Twitch. It's the most annoying sound in the world. Okay, brief history lesson. One of the things we're going to do in this talk is kind of go back and forth about trying to figure out where does stress end and begin, and where does the stressor end and begin. And so I want to go back all the way to Hans Selye, who coined the term stress, and in fact he borrowed it from the engineers, not Tor specifically. He's not a vampire. But Hans Selye borrowed the term stress from engineers, and the idea was that stress was this force that could act upon the organism and exerted an impact. So the issue with that is in engineering, stress is measured in terms of force, but in physiology, stress was measured in terms of the output or the physiological effects of this thing, this force that was put on the individual. And you can see this kind of, not confusion, I don't want to say he didn't get a Nobel Prize because of this or anything, but there's this idea that stress is both the outcome and the input. So in one of his most famous quotes, it's not the stress that kills us, it's our reaction to it. So I'd like to point out that Selye was using the word stress here incorrectly. According to him, this would be, it's not the stressor that kills us, it's our reaction to it. So this sort of idea that it's hard to tell which is the input and which is the output. My screen is switching all over. Okay. This idea that it's hard to tell what's the input, what's the outside external force, and what's the output, the physiological, the neurological, etc. It makes you think that somewhere between the input and the output, there's stress, and we're not sure what's the person and what's the environment. We're pretty sure though in this room that the output is somewhat physiological, which is exciting. Our pandemic project was to do this wonderful thing with virtual reality. We were going to bring all these people in, and it was going to be fantastic. And then, of course, you couldn't do that. So I said, thinking that the entire pandemic was going to be, 6 weeks. I was like, well, 6 weeks, we can knock out a meta-analysis, right? Luckily, my ability to tell time, both in terms of the pandemic and the duration of the meta-analysis, was wrong. So we were able to complete a meta-analysis where we found that a variety of virtual reality-based stress tasks do actually have a pretty robust medium to large effect size across all of our favorite biomarkers. The one that was least was RSA, sort of, but generally speaking, the idea that something that isn't real can cause a real physiological response pretty much held up. So then when we turn to look at the input, so what is this stressor, what is this thing that is causing this physiological output, one of the things that we noticed was that this idea that something that's not real is the thing that's having a real impact is pretty familiar to everyone in this audience, right? All of our inputs are things like social evaluative threat, uncontrollability, unpredictability, consequences where you don't know but it has impact, extrinsic morbidity, mortality cues, etc., etc. I feel very strange lecturing on this with Clemens right there. So I'm having some TSST stuff going on. What's interesting about this input is most of this is not actually external, environmental, built environment, structural, force measurable things, right? It's actually all stuff that's kind of a little bit in our head, right? So this idea that something that's in our head or the goggles on our eyes having an impact has some significance, right? So virtual reality, we can tap into all of those things even though the environment's not real or not part of the built environment. So, oh, I went the wrong way. So I want to just very briefly show 4 sims, and then I'm going to pass the baton for the hard part of the talk over to Tor, where we designed a task that has 4 different stressors, modified or built off of the idea of the physical environments that are most commonly used in animal literature. So we had high-rise, we had night zombies, which is very much like the open field maze, where you're standing in the middle of a field, and then pretty soon zombies are slowly encroaching upon you. If at some point in time your colleague grabs your shoulders when a zombie is about to approach you, let me just tell you, not cool, man. To simulate a burrow collapsing, we had the burning house, where you have a very, very ineffectual extinguisher. And then the climbing pit, which is like the Morris water maze. So we were able to show in a class project that these things do have a physiological impact. And then when we really wanted to get into it and say, okay, let's look at this, let's tear down this idea of what is real, we did not smoke pot. We just asked the question as scientists. And what we came to the conclusion of is that it's an impossible question to answer because there's a blurred boundary between the external and the internal. And this concept of a blurred boundary exists in the field, and it's called a syncytium. So if we pronounce it wrong, that's because that's the way it's spelled. And I will pass the baton to Tor to explain this.
So thank you very much for having us. And the concept here, this whole model, is we started looking at the idea of what is a stressor and what is a stress, and what are the interaction between the two. And you can see the physical, where you have the physiological reaction down on the bottom, whether it being endocrine, neural, and then the external environment stressors. But as we translate this to the psychological realm here, we have the appraisal and reappraisal on the more of the internal side. But then on the external side, we thought about, well, there are things, there's objects externally in the environment. There are these stressors, and they must have some sort of presence that exists there. And we've termed this affordances, and taking from the engineering concept here. And the interesting thing is that we started to realize that there are some parallels to what we are experiencing in virtual reality, such as the concepts of immersion and presence, which are commonly used when describing these virtual reality environments. So we decided to just take a peek and try to open up this black box of what is in this issue. So on our internal side, we started looking at, well, I mean, most of you all know this, right? We have a primary, we have a secondary appraisal that happens. Most of the time we're more attentive, but sometimes it can be pre-attentive, in which there's more of an automatic appraisal, but you're taking these up with the mental representations, trying to determine is this a stress or not. But even before that, if we move closer to the syncytium, we have this perception, the salience, and then these affordances, which could possibly be like a probability, a pre-existing bias that you have that happens unconsciously, almost in a reflexive-like state. So, talking about how this kind of translates in VR, I mentioned that these two concepts of presence and immersion exist. Well, in a VR, immersion is being surrounded by the environment typically. And presence is this sense of being there, the state of consciousness, so to say, your awareness, your attention toward it. Now, this has had a really troubled past. If you look at the first couple mentions of immersion, when they first kind of developed these concepts, you see here even in this paragraph that they describe it as immersion as this physical experience, this being submerged in water. But it's also the feeling from a psychological immersive experience, right? And then going on to talking about sensation, being surrounded by completely other reality. You're mixing the physical and the psychological at the same time. And this is the very first concept of it, the first description. And so it's not a surprise that not only just like stressor and stress, we have a tautological slippage, so to say, where even Selye got the terms confused. We see the exact same thing happening with this parallel idea of immersion and presence, where you have immersion. We have a number of different studies over the last 20 or 30 years here, where they have scales that will start by being objective, quantifiable, talk about hardware capabilities, system capabilities, but then completely flip, and you'll have other people arguing that, no, they're more psychological. And then you start getting the immersion confused with cognitive absorption and presence and self. And this back and forth of a system trying to describe, well, what are the qualities of these stressors in this external environment? So, that begs the question, what is an immersive environment? Now, if any of you have put on a VR headset before, there is a lot of different sensations that you could feel. But there's a capacity for different 3D senses, so oftentimes you have visual audio, but there are other devices out there that allow you to do smell, that have water, heat. Now, there's also a lot of talk about self-representation, being able to see your hands in the virtual environment, being able to know that as you move them, there's going to be some responsive feedback that aligns in a synchronized way, that maybe you have proprioceptive matching. There's consistent rules within these environments, such as how to open a door, if you interact with some object, what kind of consequences there are going to be. But also the detail matches the matches the degree of functionality. So if you're playing a hunting game, for instance, right, you're going to be able to have the resolution needed and the detail in the background to hear the footsteps, to see the leaves rustle, so you can find the deer. Or even the interactivity, such as if you're using something like art. So if we try to figure out on the external side how we can come close to syncytium, we can come up more with a framework like this, where again, most people have talked about the 3D sensory simulation, visual suppression. This is all fairly well known. But then we get to things that are less commonly talked about, such as more the environmental functions, right? These are these are contingencies that are more or less in the virtual environment, such as, again, the self-body representation and the interactability of that environment. But then you go even a little further toward the syncytium, and you get into the environmental quality, the features. And this really comes down to, is there a plausible story? Are there consistent rules of action-consequence relationship? Is there cultural validity, ecological validity? Now, all of these build up this and aim toward your model of how you believe that you can interact in this environment, right? Because if there's not these things, if you have physics going crazy, that's when there's this divergence, when you realize that something is not right, and you start to disengage with the virtual reality environment. And we've seen this over and over in studies as we conduct them. So it's all about like, how do we reinforce that model and then take what we know and then translate that over. So we've been working on virtual reality here since, the first times I started building environments in 2014. Most of the environments that you've seen before Sims were created in 2016, 2017. We've been able to translate them in different aspects. This is the International Space Station, actually. This was some areas we were working on. I'll just show you what some of this immersive environment looks like. So you see there's me in this environment. We'll skip ahead here maybe. Or I won't. Okay, I can't skip ahead, so I'll just let it play. But the idea here is that we can use these in applications such as training, virtual exposure, cognitive behavioral therapy, any one of these to try to give a glimpse of how do you interact with these stressors and how does that immersion then translate to stress. So this is actually a training application we built for NASA where it could measure your stress in real time and then make adaptive changes to the stressors within that environment depending on your physiological state. But this is just one application of many that we can take this direction as we look at how immersion and presence are again parallel this stressor-stress, tautological slippage and these concepts in our work.
Okay, so the lessons or what we've learned from this is moving over into less on this place where we're like very comfortable and more onto the immersion side. There's a desperate need to measure the amount of force, and we have to do that in order to understand the individual differences in the physiological systems that we're seeing. And when we got to the place of saying, okay, let's come up with a way of measuring immersion and let's come up with a way of measuring force, the amount of stressor or the dose of the stressor that's being administered, we came up with what I can only describe as a head scratcher. So what I'd like to do is end by saying, there's the challenge. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how to do this. It's really, really important, and I don't know how. Thanks.